Thank you. Dear colleagues, it is really my great pleasure to announce that today we are starting the International Academic Conference, Cultural Diplomacy and Cultural Relations, Strengthening Fair Collaboration, Diversity and Dialogue, which is organized by the University of Arts in Belgrade in collaboration with our partners. So today, at the opening ceremony, I have the pleasure to announce Professor Mirjana Nikolić, Rector of the University of Arts in Belgrade, and afterwards you will be addressed by Adrien Feix, Director of Austrian Culture Forum. Professor Nikolić, please.
Poštovane dame i gospodo, uvažene kolege i gosti, velika mi je čast i zadovoljstvo da vas u ime Univerziteta umetnosti u Beogradu pozdravim i poželim dobrodošlicu na međunarodnu konferenciju Kulturna diplomatija, kulturni odnosi, jačanje fair saradnje, raznolikosti i dijaloga. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, on behalf of the University of Arts in Belgrade, it is my great pleasure to welcome you at the International Academic Conference, Cultural Diplomacy and Cultural Relations, Strengthening Fair Collaboration, Diversity and Dialogue, organized by University of Arts in Belgrade, in partnership with the Institute of Political Studies in Belgrade and Austrian Culture Forum in Belgrade. This conference is being organized on the occasion of the launching of a new master program on cultural diplomacy within the Center of the Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Arts in Belgrade, in collaboration with a leading institution from the fields of international relations and diplomatic affairs. The University of Arts was founded more than 65 years ago as an association of 4 faculties: Faculty of Music, Faculty of Fine Arts, Faculty of Applied Arts, and Faculty of Dramatic Arts. These 4 faculties cover the widest range of the artistic disciplines and encourage comparative researches of artistic practice, theory, and science of the arts. The fundamental principle of the University of Arts has always been an approach to education based on the unity of artistic and scientific research. This is especially important for professional development of our students, their knowledge and experience. Adopting increasingly favored approaches that are not limited to one kind of arts, our university commenced interdisciplinary master and doctoral study program 20 years ago, both in the field of the theory and the domain of multimedia and digital arts. Having in mind, we could say that interdisciplinarity continues to be the principle and the framework for the further development of teaching at the University of Arts. This international conference, which will start today, show in the best way our policy based on the commitment to the concept of the interdisciplinarity, as well as the idea of mutual of scientific and artistic practice. We are honored that we have here today, both in person and online, distinguished scholars, theoreticians, and cultural professionals from the country and abroad, and we hope that this gathering will be an important stimulus for new approaches in their research. I would like to thank the institution which gave their support to the conference: Ministry of Education, Science and Technological Development, and Ministry for Culture and Information, as well as our partner Austrian Culture Forum in Belgrade and the national platform Serbia Creates. At the end, let me express my appreciation to the colleague from the Faculty of Dramatic Arts, especially to Professor Milena Rogač Mijatović and her team, and also the team of the University of Arts in Belgrade, as well as to our students, volunteers for organizing this conference. At the end, I wish all a successful work and interesting debate in the few next days. Thank you.
So, dear Rector, dear Professor Nikolić, dear Professor Rogač Mijatović, and dear Professor Dragićević, Sesić, dear participants. It is somewhat of a tried custom to start with words of gratitude on such an occasion, but I will make up for the lack of imagination with sincerity. I'm really delighted and very honored to be here to welcome you to the opening of the conference, Cultural Diplomacy and Cultural Relations, Strengthening Fair Cooperations at the University of Arts in Belgrade and online as well. In spite of its modest size, Austria prides itself in being some sort of a cultural superpower, and my colleagues and I do our best for this claim not to remain pure hyperbole. Our approach to cultural foreign policy has been institutionalized for now around half a century and is regularly updated and has gone through a number of adjustments. We now have around 30 cultural fora worldwide, complemented by embassies and consulates, and our network is dedicated to supporting and connecting contemporary, innovative, and future-oriented artists, cultural managers, scientists, and creatives from Austria, connect them with an international audience and also international peers. But even every well-functioning system must constantly reinvent itself. And for us, this means asking fundamental and sometimes uncomfortable questions. What really is cultural diplomacy? What should it be? What can it achieve and what can it not achieve? Which fields should we prioritize and which fields should we leave, let's say, to the market, to the free market? And in the context of today, what is fairness in cultural exchanges? This is a very important question. So these are questions we have to ask ourselves periodically, and I think they are more pressing than ever today, in a time when we witness ruthless aggression on Ukraine. And I think this does not only is not only accompanied by outrageous propaganda, but also a form of nihilism that challenges the very notion of culture and cultural exchange. So I think this conference is very timely also in that respect. It is therefore a real pleasure that the Austrian Cultural Forum is able to be a supporter of this conference, which brings together outstanding experts, practitioners, and students from around the world to move forward the descriptive and normative toolbox of cultural diplomacy. I wish to congratulate the organizers, the University of Arts in Belgrade, the Institute of Political Studies, everyone who was working also behind the scenes, all the students and volunteers that I've seen here for their dedication. And I'm particularly pleased that we will have for the opening keynote Ambassador Emil Brix from the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, the director of the Diplomatic Academy, probably one of Austria's finest connoisseurs of cultural diplomacy, and the respondent Miloš, who is, I think, equally seasoned. The Austrian Cultural Forum will also be very pleased to welcome you at 5 today to a cocktail right there in the embassy's garden. We're lucky we have good weather. And I will also have the honor to chair panel at 2 p.m. today on UNIC and the local UNIC cluster with colleagues from other cultural institutes on this sort of multilateral cooperation and its relationship to this fairness and contemporary topics in cultural diplomacy. So with that, I wish you a very exciting conference, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you both, Professor Nikolić, and thank you, Mr. Feix, for this nice word at the opening ceremony. And now I would suggest we just make a few minutes break until we make sure that our participants at the keynote lecture session are present. So thank you for your patience. You can stay at your seats.
French. Okay, so that's this is kind of I would say a project to now for two foundations, so Dutch foundation doing to finance the empirical study and Marcel from Belgium. So I think it's relevant because they do maximum what they could for cultural blocks in their country. Bottom up.
Saši, da li možete da pošaljete poruku ambasadoru Strugaru, da vidimo samo da li je on tu sa nama?
Strugar bi trebalo da je tu. Strugar, da li nas čujete?
Čujem vas.
Odlično.
Jutro.
U redu, ja ću inače možda više gledati u kameru nego u vas, ali nemojte uvrediti. To je zbog ovih na Zoomu koji ipak nemaju puni doživlje.
Onda predlažem da sačekamo zaista do 10. Mislim, moramo sačekati Keynote, definitivno da se sačekamo.
Bez njega teško.
We have to wait for the Keynote.
And for 10 o'clock, so to be sharp, because some people might join only at 10, skipping the official opening, saying like that.
Hvala ambasadore Strugar što ste s nama. Ako planirate da koristite kameru, za video snimak možete uključiti sada da je proverimo. Dobrodošli. Hvala puno. Ambasador upravo ulazi. Hello, dear Excellency,
Yes,
Ambassador
hello.
Brix.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the conference. We just had our opening ceremony, and we will begin the keynote lecture in a moment.
No
We can hear,
problem. Fine.
you can see the connection is excellent. Thank you.
Very good.
I have a great pleasure to announce today's keynote and main session in the first day of our conference. And to announce His Excellency Emil Brix that I had possibility to meet many times due his work as a director of Austrian Forum in Krakow and in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, especially during the 90s, when it was time of cultural transformations, time of great openness and cultural exchange. So welcome, Your Excellency, Professor Emil Brix. I will now give a short details about his biography, but also I will present his respondent, ambassador, His Excellency Miloš Strugar, and that will respond after keynote lecture, and then we will have some moments for possible questions from audiences that is online or that is here with us in Belgrade. So I do ask you to write your questions or your reflections while you are listening to His Excellency Emil Brix. Emil Brix is a diplomat and historian, director of the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. Since 1982, he has been in the Austrian diplomatic service. Then from 84 to 86, political secretary for the parliamentary group of the Austrian People's Party. In 86 to 89, head of Cabinet Ministry of Science and Research. And from 1990 till 95, Austrian Consul General in Krakow, Poland. And from 1995 to 99, director of the Austrian Cultural Institute in London. Then from 2002 to 2010, Director General for Foreign Cultural Policy at the Ministry for European and International Affairs of Austria, while then continuing as Austrian Ambassador to the UK, and from 2015 to 2017, Austrian ambassador to the Russian Federation. So you see from his curriculum vitae that he has extensive political and specifically diplomatic career, mostly linked to the region that we are also mostly found important one, which is Europe and European Union and Central and Eastern Europe. He's deputy chairman of the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe and member of the governing board of the Austrian Research Association. Mr. Brix holds a PhD at the University of Vienna, but also Dr. Honoris Causa of the University of Rogač in Ukraine and of the University of Cluj-Napoca in Romania. He's author of numerous books and articles on Austrian and European history of the 19th and 20th century. His respondent today will be also professor of Diplomatic Academy here in Belgrade, Miloš Strugar, but former ambassador, but today an executive director of the Conflux Center, very important training and research center that is organizing numerous educational activities for UN peace missions. He's United Nations Senior Mediation Advisor, independent consultant, writer and columnist, and of course diplomat. Mr. Strugar is currently assisting UN Special Envoy Mr. Geiro Pedersen on the ceasefire agreement in Syria, and is the head of the United Nations expert delegation at the Nur Sultan, former Astana, in Kazakhstan, talks on the conflict in Syria. He has extensive experience in public communications in crisis context and has been advising in this regard the special representative of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Onanga Anyanga, and the UN peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic, MINUSCA. Mr. Strugar spent over 20 years as a high-ranking civilian officer with the United Nations Peacekeeping Department in various missions in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. His field posts include South Africa, Rwanda, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Israel-Palestine, thus the most conflictual regions of the world. Mr. Strugar has lectured at many academic and training institutions in Europe, Middle East, and China. Now, in fact, I will give the word to His Excellency Emil Brix to deliver his keynote speech from vying for values and power towards cultural diplomacy as a global common good. And we are all very eager to listen to you, Your Excellency Brix, please.
Dear Milena, dear members of the conference today, thank you for your very kind introduction. Already from this introduction, you can see that I'm a practitioner and someone who talks about the theory of cultural diplomacy. And I will use this chance of the keynote to say a few provocative things for the conference and maybe also in preparation for your master program. I will say a few provocative things, not because I think one should be always provocative, but because of the given situation. I see the situation for cultural diplomacy globally in a flux at the moment. And this has to do with the rise of conflicts, the decline of democracies. We only have about 20 to 25% of democracies at the moment globally. And the return of identity politics, national identity politics mainly, on the international scene. So this changes a lot in how we should look at, how we should analyze cultural diplomacy and how cultural diplomacy really works in the political field. I think that's already my first point. We have to differentiate between the policy area, the growing policy area, where cultural diplomacy and cultural relations is being used, and I'm using the word used, instrumentalized mainly, and the research part, the analytical part, how we should look at it, how we should analyze it. Should we use, what sort of model of international relations should we use for this? Should we use the constructivist model? Should we use the model of realists or neo-realists? There are various groups, and I would propose in any master program on cultural diplomacy, one needs also courses on these formats of looking at international relations to understand how cultural diplomacy and cultural relations fit into that. So I don't think that one can have a keynote at this very moment in Europe without starting talking about the war in Ukraine. Even in the field of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations, this is a moment in European history which may be called, as the German Chancellor Scholz did it, Zeitenwende. So a change of time, or a paradigm change, you might even call it in English. And when we look at cultural diplomacy, we see immediately in this conflict already what it can do and what it can't do. Cultural diplomacy is, when we go into the very difficult definitions, is a non-coercive power. A non-coercive power. And at the moment, what we see in the Ukraine is coercive power. It's simply a war, a territorial, very traditional war with a lot of missiles being shot, artillery being used, tanks are being used, and real-time fighting in the cities of Ukraine. But still, cultural diplomacy is behind this war, because when we look at the Russian side, what was the motivation that Mr. Putin himself and his people in the Kremlin have used to argue for this war? They have used cultural arguments. The main argument that Mr. Putin brought forward in summer 21, and again then when he started the war, so a moment before he started the war, was speaking about two cultural things. One of that was there are Nazis, there are National Socialists in Ukraine, and we have to denazify the Ukraine. That's a cultural argument, obviously, that he uses. And the second cultural argument was that actually the Ukraine is an invention. The identity of the Ukraine is an invention of the Soviets and of the Soviets after the First World War. And in reality, there doesn't exist a cultural identity of Ukraine, but it's simply part of the Ruski mir of the Russian world. A very strong, a very cultural argument, which reminds us already of the book of Samuel Huntington about the clash of civilizations. So that's the Russian side. But as we see, normally you use cultural diplomacy during a given crisis in a positive way. You try to use it in a positive way. You speak about that how they can foster mutual understanding, how it can help to create dialogue, and so on. But in the Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine at the moment, the Russian side has a very difficult position to use cultural diplomacy in a positive way. So the only thing that they can do in the state media is saying that we are liberating Ukraine from fascists and from wrong ideas about identity. And then they show pictures where you can see Russian soldiers giving food and other material, maybe even books about the real culture of Russia to the so-called liberated Ukrainians in the south or in the east of Ukraine. So they can, otherwise it's only, cultural diplomacy is only seen through the Western eyes as a negative element of how Russia wants to destroy the culture of Ukraine. On the Ukraine side, cultural diplomacy has a better chance in this crisis, because Mr. Zelensky and his team, they have decided from the very first moment that if they want to win this war or to save the identity of Ukraine, they have to use culture. They have to use the idea that there is a united Ukraine nation, irrespective of the mother language and mother tongue of the Ukrainians. And it is obvious that you have a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east, especially around Kharkiv and the northeast, who are strongly pro-Ukrainian, so for the Ukrainian identity, cultural identity. And the Russians have a hard time finding enough people in the so-called liberated areas who can run, from with a Russian point of view, the politics in these regions they have occupied at the moment. So for the Ukraine side, using cultural relation, cultural diplomacy is something which is the strongest point they have when we do not talk about weapons. That's a different story. So as a non-coercive power, as a soft power, but a strong soft power, cultural diplomacy is being used and is very successfully being used by strengthening the Ukrainian national identity and the will to defend this identity on the Ukrainian side. And also when we look at images, which play an important role in cultural diplomacy, and stories and narratives, this is the story the Ukrainians want to tell to the rest of the world, that they defend their cultural identity. And they are successfully doing this by also using pictures which not only show how civilians have been killed, but also how they have to defend their cultural identity, their monuments, how the monuments in Lviv from the Baroque period and other periods have to be with sandbags secured against the Russian attacks, missile attacks. So this is very strong images again by we want to save our cultural tradition against an aggression from abroad. And this can be transformed easily into pictures, stories, narratives about defending culture by using this sort of images that are being possible. And especially on the issue of which always plays a role in European heritage, the issue of anti-Semitism and the issue of the Holocaust, the Ukrainians are skillfully and rightfully, I think, using cultural relations and cultural diplomacy to say the Russians have even attacked one of the monuments against the killing of Jews during the Second World War with their grenades, with their missiles, and around the globe you could see the pictures of this destroyed monument about the Holocaust. And later on, they even succeeded in making Mr. Lavrov speaking about maybe Hitler had some Jewish blood, and Mr. Zelensky, in spite of being also Jewish, can be an anti-Semite, and so on. So you see how political cultural relations and cultural diplomacy can become in a situation of conflict. And this is something one has to study, because we are going into an age of identity politics, or maybe we are already in the middle of an age of identity politics, as this conflict is actually proving. So this is my intro, just to say that it's not a harmless instrument that we are talking about, cultural diplomacy and cultural relations, but it's a very political instrument that is always about telling stories, and it's about values and power. Even in the European Union, the idea that we discuss now what is the role of the European Union in this coming world order, multipolar world order. We don't know what it really will look like. What is the role of Europe? Then most of the analysts are saying it's about European values and the way of a pluralist European culture, how we managed to work together in spite of all our differences on the European continent by means of overcoming to see culture as an element which can only divide us, or which can only create national identities which are isolated and have to defend themselves against our national identities. And in the Balkans, we can see how difficult this match is between seeing culture as an national identity building element, which actually should be separated from our national elements, then seeing culture as an element of a pluralistic cultural surrounding, which helps us to define common good and helps us to foster mutual understanding. Your conference takes place in Belgrade, and I understand that in Serbia, this is one of the big cultural issues that one has to discuss, how much pluralism is allowed also in the Serb society, and in how Serbia positions itself on the Balkans, and how much support of national identity, cultural identity is being used. And I myself was with a group of 50 students just recently in Belgrade and other cities of the Balkans. And I have to tell you, and this because as I said, I have to be provocative, I could immediately see, and even my students could see, how different culture is perceived in Serbia than, for instance, at the moment in North Macedonia or even in Albania, for that matter. And this plays again a very political role, and analyzing cultural diplomacy and cultural relations, one has to take this sincerely into consideration and look into historic developments in all parts of Europe, where culture had to go a long way from being an element of division of what has been called in the 19th century in the Habsburg monarchy, emancipation of nations or emancipation of language groups into an element of common understanding. In the 19th century, in the European context, culture, including religion, but including language, was mainly an element of creating national identity, not of overcoming these differences. And when we look into the discussion of the 20th century, you see how this dilemma between the two sides has even become part of the of two world wars and the Cold War after that. So discussing historical developments of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations should form a very central part of any form of educating cultural policymakers or cultural managers or people who work in the international field in culture. I could give you many examples of how when I was responsible for Austrian foreign cultural policy, I had my struggles overcoming this first idea of cultural diplomacy as working only in the national interest and not also trying to create common understanding and a common global good in various aspects. When I started my job as Director General, we had an instruction, a written instruction for Austrian cultural diplomats, which says, you are supposed to speak only positively about your nation, or if you cannot do that, at least you have to speak neutral about the quality of your nation in terms of culture. I immediately tear apart this piece of paper and told my people who worked around the globe, I said, you are not there to say that we are the best in the world and we have this idea of superiority of our culture, Austrian culture, but you are there to find those forms of dialogue which allow us to go away from struggling for values and power towards cultural diplomacy as a global common good. But I said that I will say a few words about how the European Union has a problem when it deals with cultural diplomacy. The first point is the problem the Union, I can say we have, is that there is no competence in Brussels for cultural diplomacy and cultural relations. Why is this so? And this is already worth looking into. This is so because all the member states still believe that the key issues of sovereignty and identity, they do not want to transfer to a supranational level. So that's why education and culture remains the main competence of national governments. And the European Union only has some sort of additional competence, which is called only when there is a Mehrwert, as it says in German, when there's an additional value of working together in the field of culture and education, then the Union is allowed to interfere or to use money to do something like this. This is a major problem for integration that we have, because it still tells the story that culture is a national thing. It tells the story that we have to use culture to create national identity or strengthen national identity in any case. And the second point about the European Union is there is the idea, which is actually the idea which was created already with the United Nations system in 1945, that we have universal values. Universal values, which are, you might call them all cultural values. We have universal values, which then actually, when you look into this, were interpreted as being the European values. And that's why, until nowadays, the European Union is officially saying that one of the tasks that we have, not only in cultural diplomacy, but overall in our diplomatic foreign policy work, is also to transmit our values to the rest of the world. And the expectation is that we can call them universal values. We all know that this is already a very tricky issue, because many parts of this world don't see them the same way that we in Europe see them. So one of the problems of our European cultural diplomacy is, and I include my Austrian one and others, is that we are trying to export our view of culture, our ideas about culture to the rest of the world. And the rejection is actually growing. How should we respond to this? How does cultural diplomacy respond to this? On the one side, there's a strong idea that if you're not convinced that our values are the best values for a global situation, then it is difficult for us to speak about them in our own countries. And this includes all sorts of values like freedom of speech, freedom of information, rule of law, democracy, but they are all cultural values, basically. So maybe secondary cultural values, but cultural values. In this given situation, it is obvious that for instance, in our relations with China or our relations with Russia, or even our relations with the United States of America, there are clashes. There are clashes of different opinions. What is a substance of these cultural values? For instance, give you a traditional example, the question of the death penalty. In the United States, the death penalty is in most states a very obvious instrument of dealing with criminal acts, whereas in Europe, especially in the Council of Europe regulations, it says the death penalty is not part of our cultural ideas, so it has to be abolished. And if you don't abolish this, you're not even. You cannot apply to become a member of the Council of Europe. But even more than this, it's about the idea of human rights. And the idea of human rights, which is on the basis of cultural values, is certainly different at the moment in countries like Russia, but also in countries like China. So what should cultural diplomacy do? How should it react to that? When I was ambassador in Moscow, it was one of the tasks that I was given is to speak out against human rights violations. To speak out, for instance, against all the problems that an institution like Memorial to document the criminal acts of the Stalin regime, but also of the Soviet Union overall, to criticize that the Russian government works against it, or that human rights activists were put into prison, or that Jehovah's Witnesses were abolished in Russia, were not allowed as an organization in Russia, or that liberal critics of the Russian government were put into prison, all these things. So what is the role of cultural diplomacy in all that? The role that I was given is that criticize them against the government and ask them not to do that. And in Europe, we had different ways between the different member countries to deal with this in Moscow. Some countries where human rights are a more essential part of the constitution and of the cultural self-understanding, like the Scandinavian countries, were very, very outspoken in this criticism, that they used public and cultural diplomacy to speak out against human rights violation. Some countries were, like in the south of Europe, who were less concerned with these issues and maybe combined them with commercial interests they had in Russia or economic interests, were less outspoken about this clash of civilization and culture and human rights violations. So you see, cultural diplomacy and the official cultural relations very much depends on other fields of policy making. And this is on an everyday basis, you can see this everywhere. But this was actually a sort of basic introduction to how I see this field. But maybe it needs also to speak about what is the subject, so what is the problem of definition. And I'm sure you will deal with the issue of definition of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations very often, because when you look into the literature of how to study cultural diplomacy and also public diplomacy, you find hundreds of different definitions, and you get the idea that there is no clarity about the topic, the subjects, the instruments, the methods. And why is this the case? It is very obviously the case because all the elements, even the element culture, has no clear definition. So you have to make your definitions. You have to define what we are talking about, but also the way it should act. For instance, public diplomacy. What does public mean? Does it mean that you're looking for target groups where your cultural relations should be aimed at, like all our cultural institutes are looking for target groups where they should act and how they want to influence people, other people? Or is it the public in general? Or does it mean how ambassadors speak in the public? So even the very practical things of cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy are not very clear. And then the main question of what is diplomacy about? Is diplomacy only about communication? Is diplomacy actually about power relations in a very clear-cut sense? All this has to be discussed. Diplomacy and cultural relations can find its way between vying for values and talking about global common goods. And my own view, and from my experience in various parts of the world working in culture, is that it is all about power, and it's all about how to position identities in the best possible way. With a few exceptions where there is real war waging between countries, it is mainly soft power that is being used. And in this soft power, I include economic power, because it's also actually more or less a non-coercive power. It can become a weapon, like we see with the pipelines now between Russia and Europe, but mainly it's a non-coercive power. So this is becoming the major field of confrontation between identities. And here we are in public diplomacy and public relations. Identity. And this is the moment where we have to discuss which stories are being told. What are the narratives we are talking about? We have learned in the last 150 years, at least in Europe, that the major narrative is the national narrative. The nation is deciding on the identity of whatever the community is doing outside its own sovereignty. This is the nation. Sometimes it's a nation state, sometimes it's an ethnic nation, a language group, but they want to tell their own stories, the nations. The problem with that is that there are so many other identities now being around. And we know from diplomacy how this field has enlarged into all sorts of things, from tourist diplomacy to food diplomacy, to companies diplomacy, corporate diplomacy, and the same holds true for cultural diplomacy and cultural relations. We have to, first of all, look, who are our actors? Our actors are certainly not only the states and the nations alone, although they want to tell us that they are and ever will be the major actors in the world. But actually we see that many more identities are looking for defining their own culture. This is, it can be cities, it can be regions, it can be supranational organization, it can be like the EU, or it can be even the UN is one of those identity-making actors which creates also a cultural idea about how identity can be formed. But these actors can also be individuals, and certainly also religions, certainly also be NGOs. So cultural relations, cultural diplomacy have so many actors around that we have to be careful to not to oversee what's happening on the ground. We are talking so much still about the national actors. We're talking about how difficult it is to write history books in European countries which go beyond the national narrative. We have problems even having common narratives about history between neighboring countries. People try to make a common Balkan historic narrative history book, which is not really a success. People are trying to write a common history book with Polish and Russian participants. A total failure. They published a book, but they published a book not with a common narrative about history, but with having one part of Polish narrative and one part of Russian narrative. And even between Austria and the Czech Republic, we tried a common history book, which is partly successful. So there is this problem even in the nations. But what we are overseeing is that cultural diplomacy is more and more being used by actors who work mainly in social media. All these companies who rule the internet, like Google, Metaverse, Facebook, you know what I'm talking about. They have become major cultural actors, and they understand not only that they have to try to make reputation management, image management, but also that they have to act as cultural diplomats or cultural relation people, and they do that. So they are using all sorts of elements to become one of the major actors also in the field of cultural diplomacy. So why can they do this? They can do this, and that's my major point actually. They can do this because the idea that creating identities and maintaining the strength of identities of any community is becoming more and more relevant for the position of this identity in a global world. That's because of globalization, which has not reduced actually the idea of identity, but it has actually increased the differentiating role of identity building and the idea of telling your own story. I'm coming back here to the Ukraine conflict. Mr. Putin has his narrative about the non-existence of the Ukraine. That's his national narrative that he's bringing forward. The European Union has the European Union narrative that the human rights are basic universal values which have the same worth in Belgium as they should have in China or in Russia or in Singapore or other countries. These are simply narratives, stories we want to tell, and that's what cultural diplomacy is doing. It's talking about perception. How are things perceived by other identities? How do we make sure that the stories that we tell reach the public? The public, as I said, can be very different things. And so perception management is at the heart of cultural diplomacy. Image working, branding of identities is important. And sometimes when new identities come up, their major problem is invisibility. What does it mean, invisibility? It means that they're not there as a culture, as an identity. So they have to make sure that they have some sort of possibility to make themselves seen on the globe. So one of the major reasons for small countries, for instance, to invest in cultural diplomacy is to reduce the invisibility. And what's behind that? And I know that Serbia cultural diplomacy is also looking into this field. If we are invisible, we cannot tell our story, and that's not a bad thing if you come to think about it. If you want to tell your story, you have to be visible. You have to be someone who creates an interest, someone who has maybe even a unique selling proposition, as the marketing people are telling us. And again, the Austrian case, when I was responsible for Austrian foreign cultural policy, I always asked my people, look for unique selling propositions of Austrian culture. Where is our strength? And secondly, look at where these unique selling propositions may help us to combine our identities with others. We have the Vienna riding school, the white horses of Vienna riding school, the Lipizan horses. we used that for a long time as a unique selling proposition, because this is very attractive for tourists in Vienna. But at the same time, we knew, but we didn't use, that actually there is a Slovene tradition behind that, because the horses come from what is now Slovenia, and partly Lipica from an Italian tradition. So it took us quite a long time in cultural diplomacy to say, actually, let's use it. Let's use it together, in this case with the Slovene government, and we made together with Slovenia an application to UNESCO to put it on the list of World Cultural Heritage. I'm not sure, I guess maybe it's already on this list now, but this was the first time that we tried to do it with Slovenia to do this. And I remember 10 years ago, we still had a problem with these horses in cultural diplomacy, because when Slovenia joined the euro, the European monetary system, then as every country, they had the right to put onto the coin symbols, national symbols, on the various cent coins and so on. And this was decided in one of the committees, finance committees in Brussels. And we learned after one of these committee meetings where the symbols were decided that the delegate from the Austrian Ministry of Finance fell asleep during this meeting. And what happened? The Slovenes put on one of these coins the Lipizan horses and a very famous symbol from Klagenfurt, from the Austrian part, the so-called Fürstenstein. That's a stone on where the dukes of Carinthia had been enthroned, actually in the Slavic language, in the Middle Ages. And these both symbols were regarded by Austria as a rape. It was raped from Austria, the Lipizan and this stool, actually, this throne. It took us quite a long time to make sure that we can also see this as commonality in our cultural relations, because it combines us also that we had this Slavic influenization in what is now Austrian Carinthia and Klagenfurt. It combines us that the tradition of the Lipizan horses has a strong Central European tradition. So we are trying to bring this together and now working to make it as something, as a common good. And for sure, if we have to accept that identity building is the major trend in global politics on all levels that we have, then our major issue for cultural diplomacy must be that we try to find common ground which cross these identity borders. And we have to make sure, how difficult it ever may be in politics, that not only the national narrative decides on what culture is. And maybe you in Serbia or in other European countries understand what I'm talking about, how difficult this is, that as a cultural diplomat and someone also who does research to find ways, how difficult it is to work to overcome this national narrative, which is has always been an objective of cultural diplomacy, whether you call them cultural diplomacy or cultural relations. So what can we do? I think, first of all, analyzing the given situation of this sort of cultural identity building, rereading Mr. Huntington's Clash of Civilization is very helpful already. And then we have to create trends and to use the trends that exist. And I give you only, in my last few minutes, I give you only a few ideas. Just look, we can learn from propaganda, from political propaganda, for instance. Political propaganda in the Cold War period was mainly a top-down thing, which was done by security services, by spies, actually always driven by governments, by the officials. But nowadays, even propaganda tends to work bottom-up. Why? Because this is due to social media possibilities. Now it's the trolls, the troll factories and individuals who create their platforms who can bring propaganda to the rest of the world. we're talking a lot about Russian propaganda on social media in the West, but certainly also the Americans have their ways of using means of propaganda bottom up. But we should also use that in cultural diplomacy. To overcome these national narratives, work with bottom-up approaches, work with social media, work with individuals who are not interested in the national narrative alone. And I think there's a huge field in front of us. So the troll factories in St. Petersburg may be a good example that we should use in cultural diplomacy for a better purpose. Hope that's not too provocative. And my second point is that trends is migration and minorities that we have. Migrations and migrants and minorities change the contents and structure of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations. This is a chance. This is a chance also to look into how cultural diplomacy has to work now with this plurality within its own identity, which is growing. In most of the democracies, at least is growing. In Vienna, for instance, we have more than 50% of our pupils in our primary schools are non-German speaking. More than 50%. This is a situation like in the late Habsburg monarchy around 1900, and there are lots of other examples. So we have to analyze and then in policy to integrate how we can work with this migration situation and minority situation in cultural diplomacy and in cultural relations. Just one example how difficult it is, there will be a struggle between the so-called autochthonous minorities, those minorities which say we have been there for hundreds of years and so on, and the new minorities. It's like in trade union battles, where the trade unions are fighting for those workers who are in the trade unions and not for those workers who come from outside of trade unions. Minorities, traditional minorities, are fighting not only against the majorities for the rights they want as a minority group, but also against new minorities coming with migration. That's an uphill battle at the moment. And when you look into that, one should also analyze this in the Council of Europe regulations, in the European Parliament regulations, but also in the UN system, you still have mainly the rights for so-called long-time minorities, which are based on a specific territory. How should cultural diplomacy deal with 100,000 Serbs now living in Vienna? What sort of rights should they give to them? Are they territorially based as minority in Vienna? Are they not one of those who should be given rights? You know how difficult this is. And that's not only a political issue, but also a cultural issue. And then this issue of dialogue, I'm stopping here almost. The issue of dialogue. We always say the major objective of culture is, in this international context, is that even when there is no other dialogue possible, culture can be an element of creating understanding, creating trust, and all these other things. My thesis is, in conflicts, this idea of dialogue even improves the power of big powers. So the idea of dialogue works better without conflicts, because in conflicts the stronger we can use dialogue much better than those who are at the periphery. And there are many examples in conflict resolution schemes how difficult dialogue is because of the uneven power relations in conflicts. But this is only a proposition to discuss this also in an analytical way, how this is being done. The examples are manifold. Just look into what's happening at the moment in the Western world regarding Russian music or Russian literature. The dialogue with the Russian literature and music is partly abolished. Even music which has nothing to do with Putin and his activities is sometimes not being allowed to be performed for Western audiences. So it tells you a lot about narratives and dialogue and how difficult this is. And I have two propositions which I'm not discussing, just mentioning. In cultural diplomacy, many of our countries have put a lot of effort into using classical music. Not all of our countries, but many countries in Europe have used classical music as a major element of how to work with cultural diplomacy. And my country is a good example. We regard ourselves as sort of the hub of music, like Salzburg and Vienna and all the composers. And using Joseph Haydn's word that music is a language which everybody in the world understands and which has not to be translated. But as I see it, classical music is a hopeless case. Classical music is a hopeless case. I don't think that it really helps us in cultural diplomacy anymore. And actually, it's one of those, you might even call it some sort of colonializing idea of how cultural diplomacy works. When we try to impose educational systems with all classical music around the globe. I'm sorry to say this, but I feel that there is some sort of colonializing idea in the back of also of this case of classical music, and that's why I think it's a hopeless case when we talk about universal values and the role of cultural diplomacy. And I stop here because all I said, everything I said about cultural relations was not very promising for the idea of supporting global common goods. So this is a struggle. We have to formulate in which fields can cultural diplomacy really make a proposition for creating more global common goods. I have not mentioned climate change issues where there is a big chance of doing this. I have not mentioned digitalization, with the exception of social media and the role of non-state actors for that. So identify those global common goods where cultural diplomacy can play a role, and then try to make use of that. Even someone like Henry Kissinger, who is the epitome of a realist in international relations, in his major works, he always says diplomacy has two objectives. It is for national interest, and it is for furthering a common global good. So even this realist, Kissinger said, it has to be also a furthering common global good. And cultural diplomacy is certainly the thing of the day to do this, especially in a time where geopolitics seems to overtake all our diplomatic and political efforts that we have. And I have the fear that behind the term of geopolitics lies the power of the big countries and the irrelevance and maybe invisibility of small countries and small identities. And I don't want to live in a world where there's a recolonization in cultural relations. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to Ambassador Strugar and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think you made a very actual, very profound, very provocative presentation. You have raised numerous questions, and I just wanted to say how different it is today. In 2016, 5 years ago, we had our first cultural diplomacy conference organized by this university. And it was full of hope. It was after 50 years celebrating Bitev Theater Festival and its contribution for East-West cultural relations during the time of Cold War and so on. Really as a kind of it was self-initiated cultural initiative and so on. But today, we really ended up in world with less and less democracy, as you have said, and with more and more identity politics. And that's exactly something that we are often within Conflux Center that Ambassador Strugar is leading, are debating culture as a source or a pretext for wars, as you have shown us, to what extent it is now used to justify the war and aggression on one side, or it is used within diplomatic efforts of Ukraine, again, cultural arguments. So, I mean, I could go very long in debating many of the themes and topics, especially one that you underline about common or joint or overlapping heritage, as you used Lipizaners. We here in the Balkans tried many times, we succeeded only once with tombstones, Stečak, to have a joint UNESCO application for a joint cultural heritage. We are now preparing also one interesting issue, which is Slovak knife painting as Serbian intangible heritage, which is rare case that one country is applying with minority identity as its own identity to be presented in the world. And I hope that such overlapping, let's say, common points or identities are going to grow and to be used in cultural diplomacy, as you have shown about uselessness of classical music in spite of the fact for being quite a lot of use. I would say, unfortunately, in conflictual regions such as Israel-Palestine, East-West divide is not used neither by Palestinian or Israeli cultural diplomacy, as well as in the Balkans. We have no border orchestra based in Berlin, but regrouping musicians from all former Yugoslavian countries. But no country of former Yugoslavia is using this orchestra as part of its cultural diplomacy, because all of us are engaged in this, as you said, identity building as a major point of today. But now I will give a word to Ambassador Strugar to give his comments or ideas or reflections inspired by your keynote. Please, Ambassador Strugar.
Thank you, dear Professor Sesić. Thank you for your very kind introduction. It is my great pleasure to be a part of this important conference, which is taking part at a very crucial moment for these issues which we are discussing, which are much broader than cultural diplomacy. We are talking about culture and the role and influence of culture in international relations. That is, and I'm very impressed with the keynote speech by Ambassador Emil Brix, because it put in the right context. I think this is the key question of contemporary world, where we are going to do, what we are going to do, where we are going to go. And culture definitely in a broader sense, not only as artistic and in aesthetics kind of concept, but more as a social or anthropological concept, plays a key role in this. And as Ambassador Brix already said and explained, the war in Ukraine as a culture war between Russia and Ukraine. I will just add to this that we should also look at the context and have a zoom out a little bit. It is a culture war when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, but it is happening in a very complex geopolitical and geosecurity situation. And it is, at least in Russia, it is seen, it is perceived as a culture war with the West. with the entire West. So it is a cultural war, but there are different layers. And some of the leading Russian intellectuals, are calling this existential war, which is threatening Russian existence not of the Russian state, but of the Russian people and the Russian culture. Who is there? Nikita Mikhalkov, Konchalovsky, I forgot the name, famous sociologist, Dugin, who is known or claimed as a philosopher of President Putin. But this is the intellectual elite, or representing intellectual elite. Of course, Russia is not uniform. There are different opinions, but I'm saying this is the dominant perception. This sociologist, Marija Matkiewicz, I think she's a member of the Academy of Sciences, she called it a holy war. Holy war has all these connotations, which makes it very difficult to address. And I'm dealing with the conflict resolution, with the mediation, with the intercultural dialogue in conflict areas primarily. And culture there is a tendency of some of my colleagues, practitioners, to ignore cultural differences and say, this is irrelevant. Let's focus on power and resources, something which we can tangible, which we can negotiate about. But culture is always a part of the conflict. And the key is, and what Ambassador Brix emphasized many times, mutual understanding. This is the key, and this is, I think, an essential role of cultural relations, cultural exchange, and cultural diplomacy. This is to enhance mutual understanding. Because if we even start with the basic concepts, not words, but basic concepts, the meaning assigned to these concepts in different cultures is different. Even if you take something like peace, peace for some means rule and law. That is very familiar to us coming from Europe, as Ambassador Brix said. Basically, rule of law and order. But in some other cultures, peace is harmony, internal harmony or external harmony. So the meaning is different. I mean, the words are the same, but the meaning, the concept is different. So we have to make sure that when someone who's in a conflict situation talking to us and using words like tolerance, compromise, peace, that we understand what that person means by using this terminology. So this is the main, for me, the main goal or main purpose of cultural relations, cultural exchange, to improve the understanding. So that I'm not saying that we can, get into the shoes or get into the other culture. That is very difficult, if not impossible. I personally think it is impossible. But at least when I engage, get rid of our own culture stereotypes or prejudices. And I would, when dealing with the conflict resolution, I would also suggest to suppress your own set of values in order to be able to deal with the conflict, especially if you are a third party to assist in the conflict resolution. But Ambassador Brix, I really wanted to thank you for this insightful, provocative, as you said, presentation, and which gives a very good general direction for the discussions in the next 3 days. And I see in the conference experts with extensive academic work and practical experience in these issues, in cultural relations in general. And I see one thing, this session is in English. There will be sessions in Serbian as well. But this session is in English. One question is English a threat to cultural differences or diversity of cultures? We have in the title of this conference, diversity of cultures. But English has become Esperanto, global language. Is this a threat to diversity of cultures? I think it should not be a threat, but with understanding that same words which we all use coming from different cultures and different nations and speaking, different languages, native languages, the same words we use in English could mean different things. So I think that is very important to understand. Then English is good to communicate, but to understand, you have to go deeper than this. There was also, I'm fully aware of the time, so I will just focus in a kind of a bullet points on some of the key points Ambassador Brix mentioned, and these are Ambassador mentioned so many important issues, and we can have a 3-day discussion only on the issues which he raised. But I want to specifically speak about universal values. Universal values. Universal values. What are universal values? Universal values. Most of my career I spent in the UN. So for me, universal values exist. Universal values are those values which are mentioned in the UN Charter and also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all other supporting documents. So what is it? Peace, freedom, social progress, equal rights, human dignity. All these are, and others. These are universal values. But again, I'm coming to this point. What these words mean in different cultures. And this is, culture shapes the meaning we attach to these words and also to the actions related to this. So I think universal values are essential, and we have to promote universal values. There is a lot of discussion of whether the universal values, do they still exist? Are they still relevant? But I think we have to promote this and insist not only that they are relevant, that they are essential for the international peace and security and cooperation and understanding. So, but what I would put one caveat to this, we all have to respect. UN Charter is the highest document in the international law. If there is any other international document, bilateral or regional, which is in contradiction with the UN Charter has a precedent. So these are ratified by everyone practically. So no discussion about this. But if we really want that we all respect and live by these universal values, I think it is essential to allow space for each state or a cultural group not to distort or undermine these values, but to express them in a way which reflects their tradition and culture, to be able to apply in their specific circumstances. And I think this is one point where sometimes there are clashes. Clashes in understanding, not in accepting universal values. Then, another very important thing is about identity and culture. And I would say identity is not the same as culture. They're very close, but they're not the same. Culture is about values, beliefs, and maybe the most significant part of culture is subconscious, which are actions and are dictated by some subconscious assumptions. While identity is based on emotions and stereotypes. who am I? Where do I belong? My group, my identity against another identity. And there are some identity conflicts which are happening within one culture. I'm dealing with some African issues, and you have this same Nilotic cattle-loving cultures shared by many tribes, and there are identity conflicts between these tribes, from South Sudan to Mali. If you look at the Irish conflict, it's the same culture. Religion is different, but the conflict is identity conflict. Or conflict between two linguistic communities in Belgium. So what I'm saying, identity should not be identified as with culture. Culture is, and that creates a space to address identity conflicts, because this is conscious and it's stereotypes and emotions. However, in my experience, identity conflicts are the most intractable, the most difficult to resolve, especially if these identities are linked to religion, ethnic origins, and are fought over land. If you have these three ingredients, religion and ethnic identity markers, which could be easily mobilized for political ends, and the conflict is over control of the land, these are the most intractable conflict. And if you look at the contemporary conflict, Cyprus, 75 years, Israel-Palestine, 75 years, India-Pakistan, 75 years, Azerbaijan-Armenia will probably be 75 years, not to talk about the conflicts which are very close to Belgrade. So these are the most intractable conflicts. And the identities are applied sometimes by the state to suppress, to control minorities. And because state normally express majoritarian views or major group within the state, but they are also applied by the minorities when they replace loyalty to the state to the loyalty to a tribe or ethnic group, and that could lead to fragmentation. Where is the end? How to balance this? Because again, it comes to the right to self-determination of people. This is a legally binding right, which is enshrined in the UN Charter and many other international documents. But the application of the right to self-determination is very selective, very difficult. I would say that when it comes to the application of the right to self-determination, all the states are guided by interests and politics, not by the principle. Why? Because in this key principle to regulate international relations, what is not defined is the people. Who are the people? This is not defined properly in the international law, in the international instruments. Even minorities, indigenous people, there is no full universal definition of this. So now, when it comes to the right to self-determination, the international consensus exists only for two occasions. One, if it is peoples under colonial rule or peoples under foreign occupation. Then it is universally accepted that they should have right to self-determination. All other identity conflicts, and they are, according to some people, over 1,000 currently in the world, they do not fit this principle, or each state, each international actor use their own politics, political considerations and interests to apply in a particular case. Just many important points were raised by Ambassador Brix, and I'm looking really for an opportunity to have a longer discussion on this topic, because cultural diplomacy, you mentioned definition. You know, the term cultural diplomacies contain two concepts, which are not easily reconcilable. Two concepts. What is diplomacy? You mentioned communication between the states. This is primary definition of diplomacy. As you said, you know, some American anthropologists, they came up with a list of 164 different definitions of culture. So, but if you take this definition, the diplomacy, primary objective of diplomacy is communication channels between the states, and then you add culture to this, it means using culture to improve communication between states. States are not creating culture. So that is where I think all of us who believe and promote the concept of cultural diplomacy, all of us, we should focus. How we explain using culture for the promotion of some state interests. Where is the borderline? And we don't have time to go into this. And you mentioned also propaganda and cultural diplomacy, and all this are very, very important issues. The last point I want to mention is about the social media and the high tech. You know? And this is first this high tech advancement. You know, information and communication technology and accessibility to information. We all believe that this will help to overcome these barriers in communication, that will help to remove the differences, improve understanding. However, most of us live in an information bubble. Russia, Ukraine is an example. And few venture outside of this bubble, not willing to look for moral views, world views formed by different cultures. And on top of this, now, in my view, the high-tech companies, especially Silicon Valley companies, they are creating their own ideology, in inverted commas, I mean, conditional use of that word. And I think this is maybe the most powerful ideological current at the moment. How they're creating ideology? Because they're applying editorial rights on everything which is published. We don't know they're using algorithms. We don't know, they never tell us what are the algorithms. Because if we know what is the algorithm to censor something or to allow something, then we can talk to them and explain and, you know, have a discussion. But they don't tell us what criteria, what algorithms they apply. So I think this is potentially, in my view, not fully informed view, but this is a potential danger for everything what we are trying to achieve through cultural diplomacy, basically through enhancing communication between people in order to improve the understanding. And there's so many other issues I would like to talk to, but I think I ran out of my time.
Thank you, Ambassador Strugar. I will, exactly because of time, immediately give a word to His Excellency Emil Brix to respond to your comments, or if anything he would like to add to numerous issues that you have raised with precise punctuality and importance, starting with, for example, what is bringing or preventing the usage of English language, and then consequently all the rest that you have spoken about. Your Excellency Emil Brix, please take a word.
Thank you very much for your comment, Ambassador Strugar. I liked all the points you raised. If I may respond to a few of them. Language, yes, huge topic, has always been a topic. How much is language associated with the identity of a group, even with the identity of a state, as we know in the 19th century, and how much it is simply a tool of communication. Already in the 19th century, Austria in Prague wrote a book about language, which says language has a communication value and an emotional value. And that is still true. There is an emotional value. You spoke about emotion, and then there is this communication value. I do think the more we can do that, that we separate the two of them, the better for us. So using a lingua franca like English is a good way of communicating simply. English is a language which fits, which is easier than other languages, as we know. Especially in the European Union now, without Great Britain, there is no disadvantage of any of the member countries using English. For all of them, it's a foreign language, with the exception of Ireland. Yes, and the second point is very important. You mentioned the universal values. Yes. I agree that we should try to make sure that they are accepted globally. And you said we should allow to apply them in their respective traditions. Big word, that's a big word, yes. But where's the limit in this application, in the respective traditions and cultures? And that's where we are at the moment. So some parts of the world are saying in our respective tradition, democracy, for instance, means something different from what the Western view is. So I think we should be very open in this discussion, open-minded in this discussion. Otherwise, we will lose out to sort of new borders of isolation between civilizations, which are dangerous. So try to be open for discussion, as you, I think, also would agree on. And then you said identity is emotions, and that's the difference to culture. Yes, absolutely. It's the emotional side of how power relations play out, how identity is why people go to an identity. If you are following an identity, you must have a belief why you're doing it. If you discuss the culture, you discuss the culture. But identity is full of emotions. And then you said the problem that if the conflict is big, if there is an identity issue, a language issue, a territory issue, yes. Just close, I'm not talking about Kosovo now, but I'm talking about North Macedonia and Bulgaria. How much, even with a member country of the European Union, the enlightened organization of the European Union, it's not possible to overcome at the moment this situation of conflict between Bulgaria and North Macedonia, where North Macedonia is a dialect of Bulgarian, where the territory of the northern part of North Macedonia is actually history of Bulgarian territory. You know the discussions we have. They are all these sort of old identity branded issues we have on the border of the European Union. So I fully agree. These are the most most complicated conflicts we have.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brix. I will just, because you just inspired me with this response, speaking about North Macedonia and Bulgaria, say that this year is exactly 100 years after my grandmother in Skopje realized that there are not living Serbs, but some other people. And she pushed her husband to ask for coming back to Serbia. It needed 100 years for Serbian Orthodox Church to acknowledge this year exactly Macedonian Orthodox Church as autokephal, and like this, acknowledging officially Macedonian people as different ethnic group and not as socialist invention, as many, or as today Russians are claiming for Ukraine, that many people used to say in 45 that Macedonia was invention of communists, that it never existed, that it was South Serbia, or Bulgarian were saying that Western Bulgaria cut from them. So yes, it's unfortunately so slow process. 100 years sometimes is needed that some of these cultural and religious conflicts would settle down. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time to raise questions from the audience, but I just ask you to read some comments that are appearing in the chat. Holly Hunter, thank you for your comment, and I would encourage all the participants to send their comments in chat and lead during our presentations and discussions also some kind of parallel discussion, reflection. Thank you very much. I think we are going to be inspired for the next 3 days with your words. And that we are going to contribute quite a lot with our discussions, not really to make solutions, you yourself suggested several, but to discuss possible solutions for this so slow process of cultural diplomacy efforts in the future. Please, let's congratulate and thank both.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Strugar.
Thank you, Ambassador Brix.
Thank you very much. And now we have, what, 5 minutes break?
No, Kashin will announce, we will have a break until 11:45. So for the people here that everyone can really have a coffee and then we'll move on to the next session. So 15 minutes delay. Kashin will also announce this.
Hello all and the university. Now we will just have a longer break. So we will be back at 11:45. That is in exactly 20 minutes.
Okay. Jel tako? Ja bi to, onda smo mogli da nastavimo, da koristimo pauzu za debatu. Kaže, posle nikad kraja. Ja da krećem sa mojom čašom.